The assumption was born far from any battlefield. In September 1939, when New Zealand formally declared war on Germany, the decision was immediate and unambiguous. As a dominion of the British Empire, New Zealand would fight. The question was not whether the country would go to war, but how, and who would be asked to carry its heaviest burden. For the Maori population, that question reopened an unresolved wound from the First World War. During the earlier conflict, Maori had served in large numbers, but rarely as frontline infantry. Instead, they had been organized primarily into the Maori Pioneer Battalion, assigned to construction, logistics, and engineering work. They laid wire, dug trenches, built roads, and carried supplies under fire. Their labor was indispensable, but their role reflected an assumption deeply embedded in imperial thinking. Maori were valuable contributors, but not to be trusted as a decisive combat arm. 20 years later, that assumption still lingered. In 1939, Maori represented roughly 1% of New Zealand's population. Politically marginalized and economically disadvantaged, they faced higher unemployment and poorer living conditions than their Pakeha counterparts. Military service was seen by many Maori leaders not only as a patriotic duty, but as a path toward recognition, equality, and political leverage in a society that had long denied them both. No one articulated this more forcefully than Apirana Ngata. Ngata argued that Maori participation as frontline soldiers would demonstrate loyalty, capability, and sacrifice in undeniable terms. It would bind Maori claims for equality to blood spilled on foreign soil. If Maori fought and died as equals, they could no longer be dismissed as second-class citizens when the war ended. The New Zealand government hesitated. There were concerns, quietly expressed, about discipline, command, and political consequences. Some feared heavy Maori casualties would provoke backlash. Others questioned whether Maori soldiers, organized separately, would integrate effectively into a modern European war. Still others worried about arming a population that colonial authorities had historically sought to control. Yet pressure mounted rapidly. Maori enlistment surged even before a decision had been made. Volunteers came forward in numbers that surprised military planners. Tribal leaders endorsed participation. Newspapers carried letters demanding the right to fight, not behind the lines, but at the front. By October 1939, the government relented. The decision to form the 28th Battalion, officially designated the Maori Battalion, was approved. On paper, it was simply another infantry unit within the 2nd New Zealand Division. In reality, it represented a profound departure from previous policy. The assumption underlying its creation was cautious and limited. The battalion would exist, yes, but many expected it to serve largely as a symbolic formation. It would satisfy political demands, absorb Maori enthusiasm, and demonstrate imperial inclusiveness. Few at senior levels anticipated that it would become a primary assault force, repeatedly tasked with the most dangerous missions of the war. That assumption would not survive contact with combat. From the beginning, the battalion was conceived differently from other New Zealand infantry units. Recruitment followed tribal and regional lines, reinforcing cohesion rather than diluting it. Men enlisted not only as individuals, but as members of extended communities, carrying the expectations of their WWII with them. Shame, honor, and reputation operated as powerful forces long before discipline or punishment came into play. Training began in November 1939 at Trentham Military Camp. British and New Zealand instructors quickly noticed something unusual. Drill was absorbed rapidly. Physical endurance was high. Aggression in field exercises exceeded expectations. Where other units hesitated in close combat scenarios, Maori soldiers closed distance instinctively, preferring decisive contact to prolonged exchange of fire. This was not romanticism. It was cultural conditioning intersecting with military necessity. Officers initially worried about control. They soon learned that control took a different form. Authority flowed less from rank insignia and more from respect, lineage, and demonstrated competence. Non-commissioned officers, often drawn from respected families, exerted influence that could not be replicated by regulation alone. By January 1940, the battalion assembled at Palmerston North as a cohesive formation. Its structure followed standard British infantry doctrine: 4 rifle companies and a headquarters company. But within that structure, identity mattered. A company drew men from Northland and Auckland, B Company from Rotorua and the Bay of Plenty, C Company from the East Coast, D Company from a wide geographic spread, including Waikato, Hawke's Bay, Wellington, the South Island, and offshore islands. This was not accidental. Military planners hoped that tribal cohesion would enhance morale and reduce desertion. What they did not fully anticipate was how this structure would amplify battlefield behavior. When men fought beside cousins, brothers, and lifelong acquaintances, withdrawal carried a social cost heavier than fear of death. By May 1940, after 3 months of intensive training, the main body of the battalion embarked from Wellington aboard the Aquitania as part of the second echelon of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force. They sailed as infantry, not pioneers, not laborers, not auxiliaries, infantry. At this stage, expectations remained conservative. The battalion would likely be employed defensively, perhaps as reserve troops. Their role would be evaluated over time. If they performed well, greater responsibility might follow. No one yet imagined how quickly that evaluation would occur, or how decisively it would be answered. When the battalion reached Britain, it spent months in garrison and training duties. There was frustration among the men. They had not volunteered to guard depots or march on parade grounds. They had come to fight. Officers noted growing restlessness, a sense that energy was building without release. That release came sooner than expected. In early 1941, German forces moved into the Balkans. Allied strategy shifted abruptly. New Zealand units, including the Maori Battalion, were committed to the defense of Greece. It would be the battalion's first taste of combat. The assumption that the Maori Battalion would be tested gradually, cautiously, ended there. What followed would reshape how the battalion was viewed by allies and enemies alike, and it would begin a pattern that would define the unit's entire wartime experience. Whenever a position had to be held at all costs, whenever a counterattack demanded shock rather than finesse, whenever withdrawal required men willing to stand and die so others could escape, the Maori Battalion would be sent forward. At first, this seemed coincidence. Later, it would become policy, doctrine, culture, and the making of shock infantry. Once the decision had been made, the system moved quickly. On paper, the 28th Māori Battalion was an infantry unit like any other. Its tables of organization matched British doctrine. Its weapons were standard issue. Its training syllabus followed the same manuals used throughout the New Zealand Army. Nothing in its official designation suggested that it would be treated differently from the other battalions of the 2nd New Zealand Division. In practice, almost everything about it was different. The battalion existed at the intersection of 2 systems that rarely overlapped: the British imperial military framework and Maori social structure. Each shaped the unit in ways that senior planners neither fully understood nor entirely controlled. What emerged was not an experiment, but a force whose behavior on the battlefield would challenge assumptions about discipline, aggression, and acceptable losses. The The New Zealand Army of 1939 was a small professional corps expanded rapidly by volunteers. It relied heavily on British doctrine, particularly in infantry tactics. Infantry battalions were expected to advance deliberately, supported by artillery, to close with the enemy only when conditions were favorable. Bayonet fighting existed in theory, but by the late 1930s, it was considered a last resort rather than a primary method. The Maori Battalion did not reject this doctrine, but it interpreted it differently. From the earliest exercises, instructors noted that Maori soldiers displayed an unusual willingness to press forward under fire. Where other units instinctively went to ground, Maori sections tended to advance until stopped physically. Close combat did not produce hesitation, it produced acceleration. This behavior was not accidental, nor was it purely emotional. Within Maori culture, collective honor outweighed individual survival. Shame was not personal, it was communal. To withdraw while others advanced was to carry that shame home, not only to oneself, but to one's family and iwi. In training, this manifested as a refusal to be the weak link. In combat, it translated into relentless forward movement. British and New Zealand officers initially struggled to categorize this. Some viewed it as recklessness, others as raw courage needing restraint. A few recognized its operational potential. Among them was the division's commander, Bernard Freyberg, a veteran of the First World War who understood both the value and the cost of aggressive infantry. Freyberg did not romanticize the Maori Battalion. He understood exactly what it was becoming. In modern warfare, success at the tactical level often depended on shock, on the sudden collapse of enemy morale rather than the destruction of enemy forces. Units capable of closing quickly, sustaining casualties, and continuing to advance could achieve breakthroughs that more cautious formations could not. Such units were rare. By early 1940, Freyberg and his staff had begun to see the Maori Battalion as one of them. The system reinforced this perception. Because the battalion was recruited along tribal and regional lines, cohesion was unusually strong. Desertion was almost non-existent. Discipline problems were fewer than expected, not because of fear of punishment, but because informal social enforcement was more powerful than military law. Non-commissioned officers played a decisive role. Many were natural leaders long before they wore stripes. Their authority did not rest solely on rank, but on whakapapa, reputation, and personal example. Orders were obeyed not because they were given, but because refusing them would mean dishonor in the eyes of men who had known one another since childhood. This had consequences. In other battalions, exhaustion and casualties degraded combat effectiveness over time. In the Maori Battalion, losses often intensified resolve. When replacements arrived from New Zealand, they did not dilute unit identity. They reinforced it, arriving already steeped in the stories of those who had gone before. The British Army, for its part, was pragmatic. Units that performed well were used again. Units that could be relied upon under pressure were sent where pressure was greatest. There was no formal designation for this role, but it existed nonetheless. The Maori Battalion began to be treated as a solution to difficult problems. Rearguard needed to be held while others withdrew. A counterattack required speed rather than finesse. A position had to be taken quickly before the enemy could consolidate. Again and again, the Maori Battalion was selected. This pattern did not emerge from malice. It emerged from utility. The battalion's aggressive style fit perfectly with British operational needs during crisis moments. Its willingness to close with the enemy compensated for deficiencies in armor, air support, or artillery. In situations where coordination failed or plans unraveled, shock infantry could restore momentum. But there was a cost embedded in this system. Shock units suffer disproportionately. The very characteristics that made the Maori Battalion effective, cohesion, aggression, refusal to disengage, also made it vulnerable to attrition. Once committed, it was rarely withdrawn quickly. Once engaged, it tended to fight until physically incapable of continuing. British doctrine accepted this in theory. In practice, the cumulative effect would be devastating. The battalion's early deployments reinforced the cycle. Garrison duty in Britain frustrated the men, but allowed their reputation to grow internally. Training exercises became more demanding. Expectations rose. When the battalion was finally committed to combat, it was not treated as untested. It was treated as ready. By the time the New Zealand Division was committed to Greece in early 1941, the Maori Battalion was already viewed as dependable under stress. It was placed where withdrawal would be difficult and enemy pressure intense. The assumption was clear. If anyone could hold long enough, it would be them. This assumption would be confirmed. It would also become self-reinforcing. Every successful rearguard action strengthened the belief that the battalion could absorb punishment without breaking. Every bayonet charge that succeeded encouraged planners to rely on the same method again. What began as recognition of capability hardened into expectation. By the time the battalion reached its first major battlefield, its role had been defined, not by doctrine manuals, but by experience. It was no longer simply an infantry unit. It was the unit sent forward when hesitation was unacceptable. The system had found its instrument, and once found, it would not easily let it go. Greece and Crete, 1941. The first fractures appeared not in triumph, but in retreat. Until the spring of 1941, the Maori Battalion had existed largely as a promise. An infantry unit trained, cohesive, and aggressive, but untested in large-scale combat. That changed abruptly when the New Zealand Division was committed to the defense of Greece. The decision was strategic, hurried, and deeply flawed. German forces, already experienced in mobile warfare, air-ground coordination, and rapid penetration, moved south with overwhelming momentum. For the Maori Battalion, Greece was not a proving ground chosen by planners. It was a crisis imposed by events. The battalion entered combat in late March 1941. Deployed across rugged terrain where roads were few, communications unreliable, and air superiority non-existent. German aircraft dominated the skies. Allied forces lacked armor and sufficient artillery. The operational objective was unclear even to senior commanders. Delay, disrupt, and withdraw before encirclement became total. It was in this environment that the battalion's role crystallized. As German units advanced through the mountain passes, Allied formations fell back in stages. Each withdrawal required someone to hold. Someone had to delay the enemy long enough for others to escape. The Maori Battalion was repeatedly assigned this task, not formally, but by circumstance and necessity. At positions near Mount Olympus, the battalion fought a series of rearguard actions that set the pattern for everything that followed. Under pressure from German infantry and armor, and harassed constantly by air attack, Maori companies held exposed ground while neighboring units disengaged. They did not counterattack for victory. They fought to buy time. These engagements were brutal and brief. There was little maneuver, little subtlety. Fire was exchanged at close range. Withdrawal came only when ordered, and often only after losses had already been taken. Officers noted that Maori sections tended to hold longer than expected, sometimes dangerously so, resisting the instinct to disengage even when the tactical situation demanded it. From a purely military perspective, this was risky behavior. From an operational perspective, it was invaluable. The battalion's resistance slowed German advances just enough to allow the broader Allied withdrawal to continue. When evacuation from Athens was finally ordered, the Maori Battalion embarked with the rest of the New Zealand forces on 21st April 1941. The campaign had ended in defeat, but the battalion had emerged with a reputation it had not yet fully earned elsewhere. Within weeks, that reputation would be tested again. Crete was not meant to become a major battle. After evacuation from Greece, Allied commanders believed the island could be held with limited resources. They were wrong. German airborne forces descended in force in May 1941, exploiting Allied disorganization and lack of air cover. Once again, the Maori Battalion found itself committed to a fight shaped by improvisation rather than planning. This time, the combat was closer, more personal. The most decisive engagement involving the battalion occurred near 42nd Street, close to Suda Bay. German mountain troops, advancing aggressively, threatened to break through Allied lines and collapse the defense entirely. The situation demanded immediate action. The response was not cautious. Maori companies fixed bayonets and charged. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was a calculated shock assault, executed at close range, designed to overwhelm the enemy before they could organize. As they advanced, the soldiers shouted, "Kamate! Kamate!" words that declared acceptance of death before victory. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German accounts later described the suddenness of the attack and the confusion it caused. The assault inflicted heavy casualties, approximately 80 German losses, for the cost of only 4 Maori soldiers. More importantly, it halted the advance at a critical moment, buying time for other Allied units to withdraw. This was the first time many German soldiers encountered Maori infantry. It would not be the last. The bayonet charge at 42nd Street was not an anomaly. It was an expression of the battalion's emerging combat identity. Close-range aggression, refusal to disengage, and an emphasis on shock over firepower became hallmarks of Maori tactics. Not because doctrine demanded them, but because they worked under conditions where Allied material superiority did not exist. Crete, like Greece, would ultimately fall. By the end of May 1941, Allied forces evacuated the island under constant attack. More than 16,000 troops escaped by sea. The Maori Battalion boarded ships once again, exhausted, bloodied, but intact. Strategically, the campaign was a failure. Operationally, it was a disaster. Psychologically, it was transformative. For Allied commanders, the lessons were immediate. The Maori Battalion could be relied upon under the worst conditions. It could execute aggressive action without elaborate preparation. It could absorb casualties and continue to function. In moments of collapse, it did not disintegrate. These observations began to influence planning. For the battalion itself, the experience cut both ways. Pride was reinforced, but so was expectation. The men understood that they had been used as a shield for others. They accepted this role without complaint, but it quietly established a dangerous precedent. From this point forward, the Maori Battalion would no longer be treated as merely another infantry unit. It would be treated as a solution. Whenever Allied plans faltered, whenever withdrawal needed covering, whenever enemy momentum had to be broken quickly, the battalion would be positioned at the point of maximum friction. The fractures that appeared in Greece and Crete were not failures of morale or discipline. They were cracks in the original assumption that the Maori Battalion would be used cautiously. Instead, it was being shaped by circumstance, necessity, and success into a formation whose value lay precisely in its willingness to do what others could not or would not. This transformation was not the result of a single decision. It was the cumulative outcome of crisis after crisis, each one reinforcing the last. By the time the battalion reached North Africa, its reputation had already preceded it. And with that reputation came a burden that would define the next phase of its war. North Africa, 1942-1943. By the time the Maori Battalion entered the Western Desert, the transformation was complete. Greece and Crete had not been victories, but they had established a pattern. The battalion had proven that it could fight under the worst conditions imaginable. Without air cover, without armor, and often without clear operational objectives. It had become known as a unit that could be relied upon when plans failed and situations deteriorated. In North Africa, that reputation would be tested against an enemy who specialized in creating exactly those situations. When the Maori Battalion rejoined the British 8th Army in June 1942, the Desert War was at its most volatile stage. German and Italian forces under Erwin Rommel had driven deep into Egypt. Allied units were exhausted, overextended, and struggling to maintain cohesion under constant pressure from mobile panzer formations. On 26 June 1942, the battalion was rushed into the line near Mersa Matruh. The deployment was hurried. Reconnaissance was incomplete. Commanders understood almost immediately that the position was untenable. Rommel's armor maneuvered aggressively, cutting lines of communication and threatening encirclement. Within hours, the Maori Battalion found itself surrounded by elements of the 21st Panzer Division. Once again, withdrawal was the only option. But withdrawal in the desert was not a controlled movement. It was a race. What followed was a 160-kilometer breakout through German positions back towards the Alamein line. Fighting occurred at close range, often at night, as Maori companies forced their way through roadblocks and thinly held enemy screens. Casualties were taken, but cohesion held. Units that might have disintegrated under such pressure instead reformed and continued moving. The breakout succeeded. Strategically, it changed nothing. Operationally, it saved the battalion. El Alamein became the line where the Desert War would be decided. By October 1942, both sides had concentrated enormous forces along a narrow front. For the 8th Army, now under new leadership, the objective was clear: break the Axis line and end the campaign in Egypt. The offensive opened on the night of 23rd of October with a massive artillery barrage. For the Maori Battalion, El Alamein was not one battle, but a sequence of engagements, each one costly. On 2nd November, during a renewed assault, the battalion suffered approximately 100 casualties in a single day. The losses were not the result of failure or panic. They were the consequence of being committed where resistance was strongest, to exploit breaches created elsewhere or to force them open through direct assault. When the Axis front finally collapsed, the Desert War transformed into a pursuit. The Maori Battalion advanced relentlessly westward, covering distances that strained men and machines alike. On 23 January 1943, it became the second New Zealand unit to enter Tripoli, more than 2,250 kilometers from El Alamein. The achievement was symbolic, but it masked the cumulative toll. Attrition was no longer episodic, it was structural. In Tunisia, the battalion faced a different kind of battle. German forces fought with determination, launching counterattacks designed to disrupt Allied momentum. On 1 March 1943, near Medellin, the Maori Battalion helped repel a determined German assault, once again fighting at close quarters. The final test came at the Mareth line. To break the Axis defensive system, Allied planners conceived a sweeping maneuver inland, designed to outflank the enemy. The Maori Battalion was assigned objectives that reflected its established role. It was to seize key terrain features under heavy opposition and hold them against counterattack. At Hill 209 and the feature the Maori named Hikurangi, the battalion fought one of its most intense engagements. On 26 March, C Company, under Captain Peter Awatere, captured Hikurangi after fierce fighting. That night, German Panzer Grenadiers launched repeated counterattacks. They were repulsed again and again in close combat. When Hill 209 fell the following day, 231 German prisoners were taken. The cost was severe. Nearly 100 Maori soldiers were killed or wounded. Among the dead was 2nd Lieutenant Te Moana Nuia Kiwa Ngarimu, whose leadership during hand-to-hand fighting would earn a posthumous Victoria Cross. His death symbolized both the battalion's effectiveness and the price it paid to achieve it. From a tactical perspective, the operation was a success. From a structural perspective, it reinforced a dangerous trend. Every time the Maori battalion succeeded under extreme pressure, it validated the system that placed it there. Losses were acknowledged, honors awarded, replacements sent. But the underlying logic remained unchanged. The battalion was effective precisely because it accepted risk that others avoided. In April 1943, the battalion was committed again, this time against the rock fortress of Takruna. The position dominated the surrounding terrain and blocked the 8th Army's advance toward Tunis. On the night of 19th of April, a small group of men from B Company scaled a sheer cliff face under fire to reach the summit. For 3 days, they held against repeated counterattacks. 300 Axis prisoners were eventually taken. The position fell. The battalion lost another 116 men killed or wounded. Sergeant Hain Manahi, who led one of the assaults, was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Senior officers later argued that his actions merited a Victoria Cross. By the time Axis resistance in North Africa collapsed on 13th of May 1943, with the surrender of more than 238,000 German and Italian troops, the Maori Battalion had become one of the most battle-hardened infantry units in the Allied armies. It had also become one of the most depleted. 18 months of continuous desert warfare had forged its reputation, but they had done so through a pattern of use that could not be sustained indefinitely. The battalion was never destroyed, never routed, never decisively defeated. Instead, it was slowly consumed. The collapse under pressure was not a single moment. It was cumulative. Each victory carried within it the seeds of future weakness. Each successful assault reinforced expectations that could only be met by paying the same price again. The system that had identified the Maori Battalion as indispensable had also ensured that it would bear a disproportionate share of the war's cost. As the battalion prepared to leave North Africa and move on to a new theater, the men understood something their commanders rarely articulated. They would be used the same way again. Only the terrain would change. Tunisia to Italy, 1943 or 1944. By the end of the North African campaign, recognition was unavoidable. The Maori Battalion was no longer viewed simply as a capable unit, or even an elite one. Within the New Zealand Division and the British 8th Army, it had come to be regarded as a formation that could be relied upon to achieve results under conditions where success was uncertain and losses were inevitable. This recognition was not abstract. It shaped planning. Operations were now designed with an implicit understanding. When terrain was difficult, when resistance was expected to be severe, when rapid seizure of key ground was essential, the Maori Battalion would be assigned the task. It was not written doctrine. It was operational habit. North Africa had taught commanders 2 lessons simultaneously. First, the battalion could deliver shock at decisive moments. Second, it could absorb punishment without collapsing. Together, these lessons produced a dangerous confidence. The system adapted, but only partially. After the Axis surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, the battalion marched nearly 3,000 kilometers back to Egypt. For the first time in 18 months, there was rest. Equipment was refurbished. Replacements arrived from New Zealand. Casualties were absorbed into the unit's living memory, folded into its growing internal mythology. Yet the fundamental pattern remained intact. When the New Zealand division was redeployed to Italy in October 1943, the Maori Battalion arrived in a radically different environment. Gone were open desert spaces and long sight lines. Italy offered mountains, rivers, stone villages, and winter weather that punished attacker and defender alike. The enemy, now exclusively German, fought defensively, exploiting terrain with skill and discipline. Adaptation was required. The battalion adjusted its tactics to suit the new battlefield. Movement became slower. Fire and maneuver replaced rapid shock assaults. Close combat remained inevitable, but it unfolded inside ruined buildings, narrow streets, and fortified positions rather than open ground. The first major test came at Orsonia in December 1943. Here, the battalion engaged in bitter, close-range fighting against well-prepared German defenses. Gains were made, but at heavy cost. Progress was measured in meters rather than kilometers. The aggressive instincts forged in earlier campaigns now collided with terrain that favored the defender. Losses mounted. Christmas came and went with Orsonia, still in German hands. If North Africa had demonstrated what the Maori Battalion could achieve through momentum, Italy revealed the limits of that approach. Shock alone could not overcome concrete, wire, and interlocking fire in narrow valleys dominated by high ground. No battle illustrated this more brutally than Monte Cassino. Cassino was not a single position, but a complex defensive system anchored by terrain. The town itself lay astride the Liri Valley, blocking the route to Rome. Above it rose Monte Cassino, crowned by a Benedictine monastery that dominated the surrounding approaches. Rivers, rubble, and observation points turned the area into a killing ground. Multiple Allied assaults had already failed before the New Zealand division was committed. When the Maori Battalion attacked on the night of 17th of February 1944, the objective was the railway station at the southern edge of the town. The plan depended on armored support pushing through narrow approaches under fire. When the tanks failed to arrive, the infantry was left exposed. What followed was attrition without maneuver. A and B companies fought at close range among shattered buildings and debris. German defenders, well dug in and supported by artillery, inflicted heavy casualties. By the time the battalion withdrew, 128 of approximately 200 men in those companies had been killed, wounded, or captured, a casualty rate of 64%. The attack achieved nothing strategically. It did, however, confirm something that many officers had already begun to suspect. The battalion's willingness to accept losses, which had once been an asset, was now being exploited by circumstances rather than necessity. A second assault in March produced the same result: fierce fighting, marginal gains, and unacceptable casualties. In early April, the battalion was withdrawn from Cassino, exhausted and depleted. The position would eventually fall in May, not to the New Zealanders, but to Polish forces attacking from a different axis. For the first time, the system paused. Not in admiration, but in recalculation. Commanders recognized that the Maori Battalion could not be used indefinitely in the same way, without destroying it. Replacements could restore numbers, but not experience. Each loss eroded a core of veterans that could not be recreated. Yet even this recognition did not lead to fundamental change. After rest and reorganization, the New Zealand division returned to the front in July 1944. The battalion was once again placed in a forward role, this time during the advance through central Italy. It led the push toward Florence, becoming the first Allied unit to reach the outskirts of the city on 4 of August. Here, conditions finally favored movement. German forces were withdrawing, trading space for time. Resistance was lighter, though still dangerous. The battalion crossed the Arno and later advanced through a series of river lines: the Sinio, the Santerno, the Guyana, and the Po. Often with minimal opposition, the contrast was stark. In moments of maneuver, the battalion advanced rapidly and effectively. In moments of frontal assault against prepared positions, it suffered disproportionately. The pattern that had emerged in North Africa and been exposed at Cassino remained unchanged. Recognition had occurred. Adaptation had begun. But the system itself, the reliance on certain units to absorb pressure, remained fundamentally intact. By late 1944, the battalion's reputation was secure. It was respected by allies and feared by enemies. It had proven itself across multiple theaters. It had also accumulated losses on a scale unmatched by any other New Zealand infantry unit. What remained was not another battlefield test, but the long-term consequence of how it had been used. That consequence would only become fully visible after the fighting stopped. Italy, homecoming, and the cost of reliance. By the final year of the war, the Maori Battalions was no longer defined by where it fought, but by what it had endured. From North Africa to Italy, its operational role had followed a consistent pattern. It was committed early, often at the point of greatest resistance. It was expected to hold ground others could not, to advance when momentum faltered, and to endure losses that would cripple less cohesive formations. This pattern produced results, but it also produced consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. In the closing phases of the Italian campaign, the tempo slowed. After the advance through Florence in August 1944, German resistance became increasingly fragmented. Defensive lines were still formidable, but the strategic situation was no longer in doubt. Allied material superiority and air dominance ensured that German withdrawals, though skillfully executed, could not alter the outcome. For the Maori Battalion, this phase of the war was marked less by dramatic assaults and more by movement. They crossed the Arno, then the Sinio, the Santerno, the Guyana, and finally the Po River. In many sectors, resistance was light. German forces were conserving strength, delaying where necessary, retreating where possible. The battalion advanced efficiently, often without the catastrophic losses that had defined earlier operations. This contrast was revealing. When maneuver replaced frontal assault, the battalion's casualty rate dropped sharply. When the system allowed space and flexibility, its effectiveness increased without corresponding sacrifice. The lesson was clear, but it came too late to influence how the unit had been used for most of the war. By May 1945, hostilities in Italy ended. The New Zealand division was stationed near Trieste, where a tense standoff developed with Yugoslav partisan forces seeking to incorporate the city into a post-war settlement. For 10 days, former allies faced one another across uncertain lines. The Maori Battalion remained disciplined, restrained, and prepared for combat that never came. The war was over. Only then did the full scale of the battalion's experience become visible. Between 1940 and 1945, nearly 3,600 men served overseas with the 28th Battalion. Of those, 649 were killed in action or died of wounds. Another 1,112 were wounded, and 237 became prisoners of war. The total casualty rate, approximately 65%, was unprecedented for a unit that had never been destroyed, surrounded, or decisively defeated. This figure was not the result of a single catastrophe. It was the cumulative effect of repeated reliance. The battalion's cohesion allowed it to absorb losses that would have shattered other units. Replacements arrived regularly from New Zealand, reinforcing numbers but not replacing experience. Veteran corps thinned. Leadership became harder to sustain. Yet the battalion continued to function, masking structural exhaustion beneath discipline and pride. Strategically, the Maori Battalion contributed decisively to Allied success in multiple campaigns. Tactically, it delivered results when they were most urgently needed. But institutionally, it exposed a fundamental truth of industrial warfare. Elite units are not inexhaustible. After the war, the battalion returned home. On 26 December 1945, it sailed from Italy. When it arrived in Wellington on 23 January 1946, 780 men marched ashore. They were welcomed as heroes, celebrated publicly, honored officially. Yet the communities they returned to were profoundly changed. Entire generations of young Maori men were missing. The social impact was immediate and lasting. Many veterans left their rural communities in search of work, accelerating urban migration and reshaping Maori society. Traditional structures weakened. Economic necessity replaced communal continuity. The war had opened doors, but it had also emptied villages. At the same time, race relations in New Zealand had shifted irreversibly. Maori soldiers had fought, bled, and died alongside Pākehā comrades in equal measure. Their service could not be dismissed or minimized. Respect earned on foreign battlefields translated into political and social capital at home. The Maori Battalion became a symbol not of exception, but of entitlement to equality, representation, and recognition. When the battalion was formally dismissed, its commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Hanare, addressed his men with words that reflected both pride and burden. Go back to your mountains. Go back to your people. Go back to your marae. But this is my last command to you. Stand as Maori. It was not a call to remembrance. It was a warning. The war had proven what Maori soldiers could do. It had also demonstrated the cost of being indispensable. The battalion's record showed that courage and cohesion could overcome tactical obstacles, but not the structural logic of a system that relied too heavily on those qualities. In the end, the 28th Māori Battalion did not change the outcome of the Second World War by itself. What it changed was how a nation understood who bore the weight of victory. Its legacy is not found only in honors or memorials, but in the irreversible consequences of how it was used. Repeatedly, effectively, and at a price that could never be fully repaid.